I'm the outlier or outsider here. I know very little about economics, and I was so grateful for this invitation because I hope to learn something about it at the conference, because I've always wanted to see Prague, and because I'd go anywhere to celebrate Guido. I'm here because I've written about the history of Yale Law School, and Guido's first article, which I was asked to discuss, some thoughts about risk distribution and the law of torts, bears, I think, the mark of Yale. My paper explores the atmosphere of Yale while Guido was writing it, and the possible impact of that atmosphere on Guido. Now, any historian will tell you that assessing impact is risky business. In Guido's case, he has attested, when he was once asked about what was most important about his legal education, he blurted out, "I am a refugee." He belonged to a family of wealthy anti-fascists who came to New York with nothing, and he arrived at the age of 6, knowing but 3 words of English: yes, no, and my favorite word, briefcase. He was bullied because he spoke little English and dressed differently. When his family moved to Connecticut, Guido became an outsider in Old New Haven by virtue of his Jewish ancestors, his identification with Catholics, and the fact that his first and last names ended with a vowel. So perhaps instead of looking to Yale for my clues to understanding his first article, I should, which is, some thoughts about risk distribution and the law of torts, which is justly acknowledged as one of the wellsprings of law and economics, I should be devoting more attention in my paper to Guido's flight from Italy. But while I cannot say that Yale explains the article, I can point to possible influences, raise questions about roads not taken, and identify some possible turning points that may illuminate the history of the American law professorate, the history of law and economics, and Guido's tenure as Dean of Yale Law School. The first turning point, I think, comes when the Yale Economics Department makes a serious play for Guido to get a PhD in economics, and he decides to teach. He decides on a career in law, not economics. He forgoes the PhD route and goes to law school. His career thus reminds us of how much American law teaching has changed since the mid-20th century. Imagine an aspiring law professor today in the United States with Guido's credentials, hovering between economics and law. That person would almost surely pursue both a PhD degree and a JD. Hirsch and Viscusi have shown that about 1/3 of those at high-ranking law schools have both. Now, that trend towards interdisciplinarity has brought the law schools, the American law schools, closer to the rest of the university. But the interdisciplinary turn, I think, risks fragmentation within law professors as they master 2 disciplines, each of which has an internal professionalization code all its own. That interdisciplinary turn may also isolate law professors from both the PhD discipline and the law school, at the same time that it increases the distance between them and their students who are going to practice law. Guido could avoid all this. He didn't need dual degrees. With the right grades from law school, he was guaranteed a great teaching job. But which law school should young Guido select? Here's another turning point. In the paper, I make the argument that Harvard Law School represented a better choice when Guido was contemplating going to law school in the mid-1950s. Sure, the Yale Law School had a long association with law and social science and legal liberalism, but Yale Law School was operating with smoke and mirrors, a shell game, when Guido enrolled there. The faculty had shrunk by a third. It was factionalized by tenure wars. The dean had just died, and the Yale faculty lamented that many Harvard law students had higher law aptitude test scores. Moreover, except for the 2 years he was a Rhodes Scholar, Guido had been living in New Haven since he was 7, and most people prefer Cambridge, Mass. to New Haven, Connecticut. But for Guido, a political liberal taken with law and social science, only Yale made sense. I think that decision in Yale's favor proved crucial to his development. If Guido had gone to Harvard like his friend and fellow Rhodes Scholar Ronald Dworkin, young Guido would have used Seavey, Keaton, and Thurston's cases on torts as a casebook, which opened with an ancient mid-14th century assault and battery case. Instead, Guido took torts from Fleming James, and he became inspired by James's understanding of the torts regime as a passing step on the way to full social security or social insurance without any road for deterrence. The James and Schulman casebook that Guido used began with Ives versus South Buffalo Railway Company, which became one of his own favorite cases. It included social sciences materials, and it asked provocative questions, many first posed by the great institutional economist Walton Hamilton. So would Guido have followed the same scholarly course had he gone to Harvard and had a different casebook, had learned torts from a different casebook and a different teacher, someone like Warren Seavey? Perhaps. As Greg Keating says, Guido's work is an expression of who he is, a great humanistic scholar. Torts is his natural subject because he cares deeply about harm, but perhaps not. Guido has said that he fell in love with torts in Fleming James's class, which was made to order for someone with his economics background. Where James, for example, said that no one understood the reason for the frolic detour distinction, Guido, with his economics background, thought it obvious that the answer related to the cost of the activity. And that led him to ask, he said, why not look at all torts and all law from an economic perspective? This question helped to inspire his seminal article, Some Thoughts on Risk Distribution and the Law of Torts. Ironically, Guido received perhaps his lowest grade in law school in torts, a B. But even so, he made the Yale Law Journal in his first year and wrote a draft of Some Thoughts on Risk Distribution and the Law of Torts in his second year to win an officer slot. But the outgoing editors did not like it. It was too complex, and it didn't sound like law, Guido has recalled. Seeing their reaction, Guido asked if they would mind if he didn't publish it. And with obvious relief, they acquiesced. Guido has said that this was very important because if the article had been published as a student comment, it would never have been noticed. I disagree. Suppose Guido had published the comment as a student. Contemporary custom would have prevented him from signing it, but his CV would have indicated authorship. Famous unsigned student law review notes and comments from the mid-20th century do exist. Why wouldn't a law journal comment by Guido, student, possess the cachet of an article written by Guido, young law professor? We'll never know because Guido shelved the piece while he clerked for Justice Black, a job he received after Yale's dean intimated that next to Guido, the other excellent Yale law students were, to put it colloquially, mere chopped liver. Then, after the clerkship, Guido went on the market. Another fork in the road loomed. Guido interviewed at all the great law schools of the day, Yale, Columbia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, except Chicago and Harvard, which did not then come calling. And all extended offers, except for Yale. Only Michigan, which sought a comparativist, a specialist in comparative law, appealed to Guido. Now, what if Guido had gone to Michigan and become a comparativist? Would left-of-center law and economics even have come into existence? Again, we will never know because Michigan showed little interest in constitutional law, which did not appeal to someone completing a year's clerkship at the Supreme Court. Now, a Yale Law School assistant professor, Guido resubmitted some thoughts on risk distribution and the law of torts to the Yale Law Journal. This time, the editors enthusiastically accepted it. In accounting for the difference in reactions, Guido has suggested that perhaps there were new readers or times had changed. Unfortunately, though, the article that the Yale Law Journal accepted in 1960 differed from the earlier version Guido had produced as a student in one important respect. The earlier version contained, Guido has said, a fairly full analysis of causal reciprocity that paralleled the analysis in Coase's The Problem of Social Cost. But when Guido's colleague, Ward Bowman, read Guido's analysis of why a car-pedestrian accident was not caused by either party, but was caused by both parties, he told Guido to remove it because it was wrong. Why was it wrong, Guido asked. Pigou, Bowman replied. Now, whether Bowman fairly characterized Pigou's work is a question for intellectual historians. As an economist, Bowman used Pigou as shorthand for the accepted economics of the time that said that the cost should be imposed on one party. In contrast, Guido contended that while imposition of the cost on the polluter or on the noisemaker might prove desirable instead of, say, on the pollutee, it was not a priori theoretically correct because, as Guido would say, it takes two to tango. Bowman insisted the article would prove controversial enough as it was without the inclusion of something so many would find mistaken, he said. I was young and took the point out, Guido recounted. Instead, Guido inserted a footnote which questioned why, when there is a car-pedestrian accident, it is viewed as a cost of driving rather than a cost of walking. Several months later, Coase's Problems of Social Cost appeared. Now, those two articles launched modern law and economics. Guido has compared the difference between Calabresian-Coasian law and economics and the Posnerian economic analysis of law to the difference between Mill and Bentham. As Guido says, Mill criticized Bentham for approaching all ideas as a stranger and dismissing them as vague generalities if they didn't fit his theory. Bentham, along maybe with Posner, did not realize that in those vague generalities lay the whole experience of the human race, lay the human condition. The economic analysis of law, as Guido sees it, calls for applying a theory to law and discarding ill-fitting law as nonsense on stilts, in Guido's words. Like Mill, though, Guido is a philosophical liberal who understands the importance of learning by observing, by empathizing, by experiencing, by making moral judgments and tragic choices, and of working with theory without being restricted by it. If the economic theory doesn't fit the law in the world, theory and law both need to change. For Guido, law and economics proves the more challenging and worthwhile endeavor than economic analysis of law. It's heterodox and less likely to produce a school than the economic analysis of law. In Guido's hands, for example, law and economics is moral theory. While some problems on risk distribution and the law of torts and the problem of social cost were written totally independently of each other, the two articles shared common seed ground. Coase and Guido both vetted their ideas to skeptics at the University of Chicago. Guido went there after Chicago Dean Edward Levy refused to leave Guido's Yale office until Guido had agreed to interview at Chicago. And Guido circulated some thoughts on risk distribution and the law of torts beforehand. As Guido remembers it, Harry Kalman met him at the train station, waving the manuscript and saying, "It's wrong, 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 but I wish I'd written something as wrong." As Bowman had rightly predicted, the article proved very controversial, even without a full discussion of causal reciprocity. But Guido's wrong approach didn't hurt him. He had assumed that Chicago might offer him an associate professorship without tenure. At the end of his day in Hyde Park, though, Levy astonished Guido, then just 28 years old, by offering him a full professorship at Chicago. Here's another turning point in what if. Suppose Yale had not come up with a compelling counteroffer, which resulted in Guido's becoming an associate professor in 1961, and then, at 29, the third youngest full professor in all Yale's history. What if Guido had gone to Chicago? How would Chicago have changed him? How would he have changed it? Humanists like me marvel at the amount of time that law professors spend together. Perhaps it helps to explain the development of shared ways of thinking. Would Chicagoans have converted Guido to Chicago-style economic analysis of law? In which case, Reagan might have made him a judge. Or would Guido have turned Chicagoans to the left? Or would Guido have remained, like Diane Wood, an ideological outlier at Chicago, in which case Clinton might still have put him on the bench? Other counterfactuals also suggest themselves. Guido's piece predated Coase's. What if he had resisted Bowman's urging to cut the treatment of the reciprocity of causation to a footnote? Would we talk of the Calabresi theorem rather than the Coase theorem? Might the trajectory of the Coase theorem have changed? While many have interpreted the Coase theorem as anti-interventionist, the Calabresi version of it promoted intervention. And since Guido believes in the salutary effects of multiple independent discovery, he has mourned that he deferred to a senior colleague and cut the discussion down to a footnote. If he'd followed his instincts and included a fuller discussion, it would have, he thinks, been impossible for many to reject the Coase theorem as mere right-wing ideology. Is that right? Well, others here are better equipped to give educated answers to the questions I've raised. As an historian of Yale, I see something different in Guido's treatment, however abbreviated in a footnote, of reciprocity of causation. I see a clue to his deanship, for which I'm a proud cheerleader. And so, as an historian of Yale Law School and as an historian of legal education, I've studied a lot of deans, and I've also made the case that Guido's deanship was the best, that Guido was the best dean in all Yale's history. So when I read that footnote about the reciprocity of causation in preparation for this conference, I thought of my favorite story from Guido's deanship. After a totally bruising fight in the Yale Law School community over an invitation by students to a spokesman for the Nation of Islam, many objected. Many considered this spokesman an anti-Semite. It led to a huge row in the school. After that fight, Guido was on the scene repeatedly stressing that it takes two to tango. It takes two to hurt and to be hurt. Do Fleming James and Guido's scholarship, then, explain Guido's unique style as dean? To end where we began, who knows? Who knows what accounts for human behavior? Maybe Guido identified what was most important with that answer: I am a refugee. How much Fleming James and his education at Yale help us to understand Guido's approach to torts, and maybe his deanship, and maybe his approach to life, only Guido and his biographers can say. And they might be wrong. But as the footnote in Some Thoughts on Risk Distribution and the Law of Torts reminds us, it does indeed take two to tango. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you allow me, I would just to add one comment to the list of questions of counterfactuals. Would Guido have accepted to go to Chicago? What would have become to Coase, who actually was not yet at Chicago? So, the history of law and economics at Chicago would have changed, no one knows, but it's an interesting question. And another remark, at the end of the 1960s and the early 70s, a lot of scholars have written that Coase and Calabresi were the inventors of the Coase theorem. So in the end, I mean, the history acknowledged that the proximity between the two papers. So there's, even if at that time it was not acknowledged, it became like that. So, Guido, you want to say something?
Well, a couple of comments. One, that I think that, and this is what you and Medina have been focusing on, that too much attention has been paid to what happened after 1970, after my book, The Cost of Accidents, came out, and after Dick Posner did his magnificent work, but too little attention has been paid historically to that decade between 1961 and 1970, when Coase was fairly ignored, slowly picked up by economists, and very little among lawyers, and where instead my work was being considered very controversial by lawyers who didn't understand economics. And I think to understand what was happening, one should really focus more on that time. And then after Coase became dominant in economics, and ever more dominant in economics, as he should have. No one should ever take anything away from Coase. Fantastic. And also, the law side came to be economic analysis of law because of Dick Posner's great work. But that earlier part is something which is really important in understanding this whole relationship. As to what would have happened had I gone to Chicago, I want to pay homage now to a couple of people who were my teachers, because I think that I would not have changed had I gone to Chicago. Whether Chicago would have changed, I don't know. I don't really much care. Chicago is wonderful in what it is. But I want to pay homage to the person who first taught me economics, Econ 10, basic economics, who was Warren Nutter, the founder of the Virginia School, where Coase was, and the most conservative Chicago Frank H. Knight, Herbert Simon person that there is, and who taught me that, and who loved me, and whom I loved, who died young, sadly, and with whom I argued all through Econ 10. Because I was already taking my positions in that. And then the greatest teacher of all, I had as tutors James Tobin, I had Sir John Hicks and Lawrence Klein, 3 Nobel laureates, as tutors at different times. But my greatest teachers of all was William Fellner, a Viennese, Hungarian, who came to Yale, who was older, and who was a true Viennese economist. And he had more influence on me and how I thought than anyone else, immensely broad. But again, he loved me, I loved him, but he didn't change my views. So I think had I gone to Chicago, I would have remained the quirky fellow that I am. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we have a few minutes.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, sure.
I bet Coase would have still gone because Guido would have convinced him to go. So they both would have been there.
But he should have convinced Stigler to attract Coase. Anyway, so we have still a few minutes for questions, if there are questions. Otherwise, no questions?